Richard, welcome to the podcast. I wanted to start at the beginning today because English whisky has had this meteoric rise in the last couple of decades, and I thought that you might be one of the best people to take us through it. So, if possible, starting at the beginning, how did we get to where we are today?
Hey Tom, great to be here. English whisky, a lot of people talk about the Alfred Barnard book of distilleries from the 1900s, and there were English distilleries producing whisky products in the sort of early 1900s when they closed down in Lee Valley in London and Fox Distillery up in Liverpool. But that wasn't really English whisky in the way we understand it today. Most of it went to Scotland or Ireland for blending. You couldn't go to the distillery and get a bottle of English whisky. So if we sort of park that for a minute, then really it's 2003 when Hicks and Healey in Cornwall, which is a collaboration between Healey's Cider Farm and St Austell Brewery, they started producing whiskey as a collaboration down there, but they didn't actually release that whiskey until 2011. So although they have the accolade of being the first modern English whisky, the first release actually came from St George's Distillery, which is now the English Distillery in Norfolk. So they set up their own distillery. It was actually quite fortuitous, really, because the Nelstrop family, James Nelstrop, Andrew's father, wanted to just make some whiskey for themselves. He was involved in farming and growing grains in Norfolk, and a lot of those grains went to Scotland. But he found that HMRC had a quite historic rule that you couldn't start a distillery with a still smaller than 1,800 litres. And so before that was contested by Sipsmiths a little bit later, he went, okay, then let's build a distillery. Let's do it properly. And so we actually have for once HMRC to thank for something, which is they really did create the beginning of the English whisky story in kind of forcing the Nelstrop family's hands to build an actual distillery. And so from there, it sort of grew, and very much, in turn of the boom in kind of spirits production, craft spirits production across the board.
And how many whisky distilleries do we currently have in operation in England today?
So there are 50 on the English whisky map, which is produced annually by Cooper King Distillery. We have a more kind of interactive Google map version on our website, but theirs is a really lovely kind of publication that they do annually. I actually just did some quick maths. So there are 21 distilleries out of that group that actually have whisky. So their spirit has matured for at least 3 years. And of the 21, 20 have actually released whisky already. So 50-ish in terms of distilleries, but obviously not all of them have reached that point yet, and some will literally have just started that journey.
And it really is this meteoric rise, because if you go as recently as 2015, that number would be so much smaller, right?
Yeah, 100%. So early doors, you had the Lakes, Cotswolds, Spirit of Yorkshire, Adnams, Copper Rivet, all sort of pre-2020, but so many of the distilleries on the map now are the sort of younger ones. So, we're seeing a real boom, especially with kind of brewers or other spirit distillers kind of switching into whiskey. And some of these producers are laying down a cask a month. We're talking very, very small production. But others, are doing it on a much grander scale. So it's been a huge rise. I think there's now predicted to be £1 billion worth of English whiskey casks maturing across the country, which is, for an industry that's really less than 20 years old, or about 20 years old, that is pretty phenomenal in terms of just the sheer economics of it.
And what is it that you think has sparked this rapid growth in production?
So I think there's a few things. Obviously, coming off the back of the craft gin movement, which, as I alluded to earlier, was very much from Sipsmith challenging that still size requirement. So once you could use smaller stills to make gin, it wasn't much of a leap to make whiskey as well. So from a kind of really small end craft production, the opportunity was there. But I think it was more than that. It was coming off that boom in people wanting really flavoursome, locally produced spirits. You also had the global world whiskey market, and suddenly Scotch, Irish and American weren't the only options, and certainly not the only quality options out there for whiskey. Japan, Taiwan, Australia. So I think, people started thinking, well, if you can do it everywhere, then actually, England can also do it. We don't have to not do it because the Scotch do it or the Irish do it. So, and I think, the local food movement, the slow food movement, people just wanting that connection to what they consume and being able to tell the stories behind it. So I think you put all that into a pot, and suddenly starting a distillery seemed like a really good idea 20 years ago. Maybe not such a good idea today, but we'll get onto that later.
And I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about some of the biggest success stories that we've seen in the English whiskey industry so far.
It's really hard because what do you mean by success? I guess each distillery is going to have their own metric for that, right? So, Hicks and Healy's the first to lay down modern English whiskey. English Whisky Distillery, previously St George's, first distillery, first release. They've now got the oldest English whiskey on the market, which is a 17-year-old. If you're talking about commercial success, then the Lakes have just been bought out by Nye Timber, so that's the first acquisition within the English whiskey world. Cotswolds obviously have their big expansion, and they're working with Berry Brothers and Disaronno. So there's some really fascinating stuff happening on the bigger scale at the top end. But then you've also got people doing really innovative things, which that you probably wouldn't do if you were striving for commercial success. So Retribution, Richards sourced English peat from the Somerset levels, and he's literally doing the whole process himself. So he's drying it, he's kiln making the green malt in a B&Q shed, and then he's making his own peated whiskey. Now that's going to be a phenomenal success, but I know from speaking to him, it's not going to be a commercial success in the sense of it's not scalable at this level. So I think everyone's got a different metric, but right now I think the success is that we're talking about English whiskey.
Absolutely. And of course, Retribution will have their first bottles to sell in just a few months from now, I believe.
It feels like a domino effect at the moment. They just release after release, which is really exciting.
Would you say that we're at the point where we could potentially describe English whiskey as having a certain identity in the way that Scottish, Irish and American whiskey generally has?
It's a really interesting question, and when you sent them over in advance for me to prepare for this interview, it got me thinking that we talk about a Scotch identity, but there isn't really a Scotch identity. I can drink a Lafroig and then a Mortlach, and they're completely different things. And I think English whiskey has so much variation, both in terms of scale, in terms of grains, yeast, production process, still types. I think what binds English whiskey together, from my experience, is that all English whiskey producers are striving to create a lot more flavour in a younger whiskey than you potentially would need to do for a traditional Scotch or Irish approach to whiskey production. So wanting to sell whiskey and release whiskey between the sort of 3 to 6 year age mark, you've got to do things differently. There's a reason we don't drink 3-year-old Scotch. It's because at that point, it hasn't had enough time in the cask. It probably wouldn't taste that great because the maturation is very slow. And also, most of the bigger name distilleries in Scotland, there are craft distilleries there as well, but most of them are not producing a spirit in a manner where it's drinkable at a young age. And that, it's very deliberate, and that's not, there's no secret about that. But I think that's where English whiskey and the craft sector in general, globally, if you look at Milk and Honey in Israel or Kavalan in Taiwan, they're doing everything they can to inject as much flavour authentically, we're not adding anything, as possible for a young spirit. And that seems to be the singular factor that runs across all English whiskey at the moment.
And that's definitely something I'm seeing when I'm talking to producers. I think we've got Jim Swan to thank for a lot of this. He was involved heavily with Cotswolds, with the Spirit of Yorkshire and Lakes as well as places like Milk and Honey, I believe. And it's this idea of sort of really front loading flavour creation by getting these really sort of long fermentation times, and then kind of backing that up with super slow distillation, which of course takes a lot longer to do. And I think if you're talking about your traditional Scotch whiskey brands where they're trying to get that double distillation done as quickly as possible so they can get it in barrel and move into flavour creation over many years, the difference here is that flavour creation happens early doors, and then you stick it in barrel, and hopefully it doesn't need to spend as long in there to actually come out the other end as a really delicious whiskey. I think the other thing that we're seeing as well is the use of these STR casks, which I think is Jim's, which have kind of been shunned by many in the Scotch whiskey industry. And they seem to be really, really successful for a lot of these producers down in England. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think like anything, it's personal taste. I know people that absolutely love whiskey producing STR casks and other people that are not big fans of it. But I think it speaks to a bigger shift, which is that every phase of the production process and every supplier involved is also having to up their game and help distilleries on that journey. The cost of barrels has gone through the roof recently. So any way that you can get good quality wood, with a decent flavour profile. But we're seeing innovation from yeast companies. We're seeing innovation from grain suppliers, from farming. Regenerative farming is really big, heritage grains. So I think as a distillery, you choose which of those you're going to hang your hat on, and it could be multiple ones. No one's doing everything because that probably would be a bit crazy. But I think the STR cask is really a response to an industry that's going, hey, we want to create more flavour. We want to have fun with this process and push boundaries and challenge preconceptions. And it's a very well-known example of that. But I think we're going to see a lot of innovation, like I said, with things like yeasts and other stuff coming through, which as well, because of that shift to creating flavour early doors, as opposed to relying on the wood to do all of the work over a longer period. I think we're actually going to see less consistency in the product, especially early on, which is really exciting because when you are getting single cask releases, you can have, I've tried 2 barrels that were the same liquid, same barrel style, next to each other in the warehouse, and they tasted completely different. And we obviously don't know exactly why that is. There's so many factors. But I think it's not about creating this consistent product where you can say this is our 12-year-old whiskey and it's the same every time. So you can play around with all of those factors and change cut points, and there's just a lot of options for distillers now, which makes it really exciting and also helps you create your USP as a brand, because that's the challenge, isn't it? Ultimately, we don't want 50 identical distilleries in England.
Absolutely. And I think you've hit a really interesting point there as well about this differentiation. There's so many, particularly of the more recent distilleries, the ones that have come up since sort of 2017, where you do find batches coming out almost sort of every 3 months. And there's really a kind of moving away of this concept of a core product that we're so used to in the whiskey industry. And it's in one way I can see how it's quite difficult because you've got to continually update your marketing and you're pushing something new. But at the same time, from somebody who drinks a lot of whiskey and from somebody who talks about whiskey a lot, it's great because you've always got something new to talk about.
Yeah, I think the story that I love is the English distilleries. They recently won World's Best Single Malt at the World Whisky Awards for their new sherry cask release, which was supposed to be their core range. But because it's batch produced and because they won the award, they sold out of the first batch. So all of a sudden, something they'd added to their core portfolio wasn't available until they could release the next batch. So, those are great stories. That goes to show that even where distilleries reach the age and the depth and breadth of cask maturation, that they can have these core products, it's still being made in batches with that attention to detail. This is mostly hand produced product. This is not a machine sort of churning out an identical product. So I love that, and there's people behind it, and they were probably kicking themselves that they didn't have more, but it just means when they release the next batch it'll be very popular too.
It's fantastic marketing as well. The same thing happened with the Lakes maybe 2 or 3 years ago with their batch 4 of their Whiskey Makers Reserve. And it really just put them in the limelight. And I suppose it put in the groundwork to where they are today with the expansion that's going on there. Exciting times moving forwards. Would you say, or if I was to press you, is there anything that you would say that makes English whiskey particularly unique as a category at this time?
I think going back to what I was saying before, it's that sort of pursuit of flavour early doors. It's that sort of innovation. You've got Cooper King Distillery, who were inspired by a trip to Australia and Tasmanian whiskey production, and places like Sullivan's Cove. They've got a Tasmanian still, but rather than just saying we'll do what Tasmania's doing, they're then pushing that still. They've coated it in a NASA grade paint, so they have zero heat loss because they're very sustainable. They're working with really interesting cask types. So it really does seem that whichever way you approach it, English whiskey's binding sort of factor is that pursuit of flavour as early as possible in the production process through, as you said earlier, long fermentations, different yeast strains, often kind of open top fermentation. So there's kind of natural bacteria in the mix. Those long, slow distillations. A lot of distilleries using direct heat, so you get that Maillard effect, and I never pronounce it properly, but essentially the sort of burning of the spirit in the still because it's directly heated. And I don't know the science, and I often get bamboozled when distillers very excitedly tell me what enzymes their yeast strains are producing, and I just have to nod along and go, it tastes delicious. Yeah, it's an excitement and a sort of inspirational innovation scene. That is really what's happening in English whiskey, is it's innovating and it's pushing boundaries.
One thing I found really interesting is this sort of duopoly in terms of styles, where English whiskey is currently unbound by a lot of rules and regulations that you might see in places like bourbon or Scotch or Irish whiskey. And we've sort of seen two styles emerge, one that seems much closer to Scotch whiskey, being our neighbours to the north, but also a much more kind of embracing of global world whiskey styles. I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's inevitable that if something you've drunk and love, so take Scotch, for example, there's a lot of English whiskey founders who were inspired by their love of Scotch. So it's inevitable that some will pursue a sort of similar style. A lot of the barley that's used in Scotch production is grown in England. So, if like with the Nelstrops or Spirit of Yorkshire, if you're literally growing barley that you're selling to Scotland for someone else to make whiskey, you can make the same style of whiskey, on your own doorstep. But even where there are whiskies that could be sold in Scotland, if you sort of did a blind tasting, that many people might not realise they're not Scotch. But even in that, there's so much variation. So the Lake's very much focusing on the cask process and élevage and really kind of using the wood to create those flavour profiles versus say Copper Rivet or some other distilleries that are really working on every step of the process and those long fermentations and kind of the spirit being very important to that flavour profile. And then you've got the flip. So Whittaker's who just released their first whiskey. It's a Scotch style whiskey, but it's actually made in a very American way. They've got American distilling kit. They've actually got American distillers. That's a story for another day. We did have COVID to thank for that. And they're producing a whiskey that in style is quite Scotch, but so many of the factors that go into it have been inspired by American craft distilling. And then, you've got places where they're literally growing the grain on the same land, Witchmark Distillery in Wiltshire. They're taking barley, which is grown regeneratively from the Fonthill estate, and it only goes 20 miles down the road to Warminster Maltings before coming back again. You've got this like estate whiskey in the truest sense of the word. But then others are doing stuff that really pushes the boundaries. We've got ice stills being used to produce whiskey. So if you don't know what they are, they're like the sort of Tesla of stills. They're kind of steel boxes with iPads attached and allow you to do things that you can't do with traditional copper stills. And we've got innovation, the peat, the unpeated, rye whiskey, corn whiskey, there's oat whiskey, and there's casks that can't be used in Scotland. So things like chestnut. Yes, chestnut. So there's different wood types that allow us as English whiskey producers to make things that you couldn't make under the very sort of restrictive regulations up in Scotland.
What do you feel are the biggest challenges facing English whiskey producers at the moment, and how do you see the industry overcoming these challenges in the future?
It's money. I mean, even Diageo's results recently have shown that there's a global downturn in whiskey purchasing, and the cost of producing it has also risen. So, right now, we know the cost of energy is through the roof. It's a very energy-intensive industry. The cost of grains has gone up. The cost of barrels, as I said earlier, has gone very high. Casks used to be $150 for an ex-bourbon. It's now $250, $300 for an ex-bourbon. So all of that trickles through into higher prices. Duty is horrendous on spirits. Come on, new Labour government, let's sort that out. But I think the flip of that is that during COVID, everyone was hoarding whiskey. Everyone was buying every first release because we're all sat at home with nothing to do, joining online tastings, wanting to, inject fun into our lives. And I think coming out of that, people have gradually started to buy less. There's also a lot more first releases, so it becomes very competitive and people want to try before they buy. So I think it's a kind of perfect storm where the cost of producing is up, the number of people buying is down, or maybe the amount that people spend when they buy is down. I think that the one sort of silver lining is that people do want to buy better. So as long as you're an authentic brand and you're positioning your product as this kind of locally made, craft made product of high quality and intense flavour, then I think, you will be relatively safe. Everyone's going to struggle a bit, but you can, adjust your margins and sort of see out the storm. But it's a tricky time, which is why I mentioned earlier, if I was asked, do you want to start a distillery today? I think I'd want a time machine and go back 20 years to when English whiskey started, because I think today would be very, very challenging. There are people doing it, and I tip my hat to them and I wish them every success. but it is a tricky market right now for everyone.
What are some of the most exciting things you'd like to see happen in the industry over the course of the next 5 to 10 years?
I mean, it's really exciting, as I said, that we're getting new releases, first releases from new distilleries quite frequently now. So that's a really nice thing. We're going to see the first 20-year-old English whiskey probably within the next few years. Production volumes are going up. English whiskey should become more affordable over time. Once we get over this kind of blip at the moment, cost-wise, we should see prices come down as distilleries expand, production increases, the stock of casks increases. I think really, I just want to keep seeing this innovation and this excitement. I don't want us to end up in a world where we've just got all these sort of homogenous generic whiskies because the market demands, it's all driven by price. So I hope that however brands expand and grow and shift, that they can retain their core purpose and mission, which at the moment is very exciting for most of them.
So let's shift it up. Let's talk about some of the projects that you're heavily involved with yourself. Exploring English Whisky and the English Whisky Festival, of course. How did these entities come about, and what's the overall concept behind them?
So I kind of came into whiskey in a slightly backward way. So I was working at an agency alongside Diageo, and we were doing lots of kind of photo and video shoots, and there'd be half a bottle of Johnny Walker left afterwards, and we'd all share it as a crew. And I started to kind of link the liquid to the marketing stories and the branding. I got really interested in the sort of depth of history around Scotch, but this was also sort of coinciding with COVID and things. So actually my first distillery tour was actually Bimber in West London, which, if you've been, is not the most beautiful setting for a distillery. It's not your picturesque, Scotch brook and mountains in the background. It's an industrial estate with mechanics in a sort of snack factory next door. But I think that's what really made me sit up and think, well, wait, if you can create such an amazing product in such an incongruous location, there's something really exciting going on here. And I was doing tastings, and we did a big online one during lockdown, so that ballooned, and that became the English Whisky Festival, which we ran virtually for 2 years. And so off the back of that, coming out of lockdown, I sort of quit my job and really wanted to grow that. And so Exploring English Whisky is our membership organisation. So you can join, and at the moment, you join and you get discounts on everything we do. So whether that be tickets to our festivals or tastings, we're doing a lot more distillery tours now, which is really exciting. So actually meeting people in the real world and going to these distilleries and letting them tell their stories. And we released our first independent bottling at the end of last year, which is a 9-year-old Adnams, which is, I like to describe it as Marmite because people love it or hate it, which was what we were going for, really. It's a fantastic single malt that spent a lot of time in a second fill French oak cask and then is finished in a Sauterne wine cask. And it's very rich and complex and has tons of flavour and works really well in cocktails as well. So yeah, there's lots of things going on. But I think, the flagship part of that is the festival, which is on the 23rd of November up in Birmingham. We've got 30 English distilleries coming this year, which out of 50, given that only 20 have actually released whiskey, is amazing. So 30 brands coming to share their wonderful products. We do masterclasses, we've got food court, we've got our shop, so you can buy the bottles of what you're tasting, which is always a nice touch. And yeah, it's just a wonderful day. It's lovely for the distillers themselves, actually, and the brands to get together, because they talk and they have, if they're part of the guild, they have meetings, but not everyone's part of the guild. So it's just a nice day for everyone to come together, try each other's products, hear about the challenges and the opportunities and what everyone's doing. And yeah, for consumers, it's not a bad gig either. So you get a lot of spirits and whiskey included, and you get to taste your way around England in one place, which is pretty handy.
And where are the festivals located?
So we're in the Bond in Digbeth, which if you've seen Joe Lycett's Channel 4 show, that's exactly the same venue where they film that. So that's up in Birmingham, so that's in November. I do run other festivals. They're not ostensibly English whisky festivals, although we have a heavy presence of English whisky for obvious reasons. So they're in Croydon, and we're doing Bristol for the first time in February next year as well. So that comes under Exploring Whisky as opposed to Exploring English Whisky, just to keep everyone on their toes.
Before we finish, how can we keep up to date with yourself and all of these fantastic projects you're working on?
So obviously you can find us on social channels. Our website is exploringenglishwhisky.co.uk. We're Exploring English Whisky or Explore Eng Whisky, depending on how many letters we're allowed in our handle across various platforms. But yeah, we're very prevalent on all of Instagram and Twitter, Facebook. So yeah, check us out, and please come to one of the festivals. Come and check out English Whisky. Come on a distillery tour. It really is such a fascinating and inspirational category at the moment that I absolutely love it. And if my enthusiasm can just bring 1% more people from other whiskey categories into English, then actually for the English category, that's huge. So come along.
Richard Foster, thank you so much for your time. That was absolutely brilliant. Cheers.
Thanks, Don.